we all have faults and things about ourselves that we should change that maybe we're aware of, or maybe we're not aware of, or maybe we refuse to acknowledge them that hold us back. You know, one of the big ones that I generally tend to suffer from, which is ironically enough tied to one of my last videos, is that I generally tend to be how do I say this? I tend to be a person who seeks solitude too much. I tend to be a very lonerish type person, and I've always been like that because of mainly because of where I grew up and because of the people that I've had throughout the majority of my life. They haven't really been people that, for the most part, are you want to be around. So I got very accustomed to the idea of being alone, always wanting to be alone. It's one of the reasons why like I said, and I think I said this in one of my earlier videos, I always romanticize the image of like the loner, like the man with no name out in the middle of the desert, walking all by himself, doesn't need anybody, doesn't need anyone. He's just by himself. And, there is some good traits to that. I mean, you do have to be comfortable by yourself and you have to be strong on your own, independence and all of that. So there is a lot of strength in that, but there's also, unfortunately, it can be taken too far. And this is something that I didn't go through. I also tend to be very introverted. I mean, I know probably because of these videos, I probably don't seem that way, but I'm not the kind of person that likes to reach out. In fact, I tend to be very defensive about that because, again, where I grew up and the people that I've been surrounded by most of my life and where I currently am right now, generally speaking, like friendship doesn't really mean anything. And I mean that leads to my other point. The problems with the modern world and the ideas of friendship where they don't really mean anything anymore. Community for the most part is dead. And friendships, I mean, they really only go in the direction of like, well, can I have fun with this person, or is this person somebody who can give me fun? I mean, it's very rare that you actually find friends that genuinely really, that are there for you, that'll be there for you. I generally I tend to think that way, that I would be there for a lot of my friends, or at least I like to think that that's what I would do. But the thing is that, it's hard to find that in the modern world, and it leads to a lot of bad habits, which in a way is kind of one of the reasons why I brought up the bad habit of I guess you could call it loner syndrome, where you get to the point where you're just so alone, like you're so used to, and you don't trust anybody, and you don't really see anything good in people, or you don't really know if what you can see is good in people, that you seek solitude. You don't even want to be around anybody. And I'll admit that this has unfortunately led to me hurting people that probably didn't deserve it, particularly when I was traveling, and also to a certain extent, even where I currently am. But I think it also leads to another thing about these habits that, it leads to another thing that I was mentioning about how you have to break these habits, but that it's not easy. And I talk about trying to be better a lot. I talk about how you have to be moral, but more or less, I talk about being able to like fix yourself and fix certain things about yourself that are holding you back. And I know there's probably a lot of people, and I've met a lot of people who struggle with changing certain things about themselves, and I get it. Maybe sometimes you're not surrounded by people who are helping you out. Maybe sometimes it's hard to discipline yourself because you're so far down the rabbit hole, and taking baby steps, you've tried it, and you just can't seem to stick with it because of whatever reasons. And I think that a huge chunk of it, as I mentioned before, is really just the anti-human mentality, or the anti-human way of life that is promoted so much nowadays. You know, we have this idea, as I mentioned before, I mean, like friendships for the most part are just about having fun now. They're not really about being there for one another. I mean, community for the most part is dead, as I've already said before. And a huge chunk of helping you become a better person is the people around you or the community around you. Now, I'm not saying you can't do it on your own, but then again, as I said earlier, there is such a thing as taking it too far. I mean, human beings are not meant to be atomized. We're not meant to be to the point of just being alone and not really reaching out to anybody, or just not, like, I guess you could say, we're not really meant to live the way we live nowadays with materialism and superficiality and all these different things. And I think that's one of the big reasons why there's so many problems right now, when there's so much drug addiction and so much, habit forming things, because people want to escape. And I mentioned earlier that in one of my other videos that if you do something simply because you want to escape, that doesn't make your problems go away. They're still going to be there. And as a result, you need to actually fix those things. But at the same time, I also understand that sometimes, and in our current way of life, it's hard because sometimes you don't really have people there to, back you up. Sometimes there's even people, I mean, I've experienced this where I've had people who seriously wanted to peg leg me for whatever reasons. Maybe they wanted to peg leg me because I made them look bad and they didn't have the discipline to do it. And if they had to be miserable, so did I. And, I still managed to go ahead and do it. It's also one of the reasons why some of the other things that I tend to suffer from is also anger. I still get a lot of thoughts in my head, like a lot of really angry thoughts, but thankfully I can control it. I don't rip anything apart or anything like that. But, and to be honest, I actually kind of feel bad for some of these people because, I remember seeing what happened to some of these people later on in life, and let's just say that divine retribution is a real thing. I don't believe in karma, but I do believe in divine retribution. And the thing is, like, that's a different video for a different time. The thing is, I don't know exactly what kind of advice I can really tell people in terms of sometimes you're going to have to do it alone, because it seems cliche to basically just say to people, like, oh, well, think of how awesome the story is going to be if you do it all by yourself. And it's like, well, yeah, but just considering how people nowadays are very atomistic and they don't really care. It doesn't matter how awesome your story is because nobody's going to care. I mean, you shouldn't be doing it for other people, anyways, so to speak. To a certain extent, you should, but not completely. But the thing is that, nobody's going to care. So, I mean, no matter how awesome your story is, nobody cares. But the thing is that, really, all I can really say is that you have to take baby steps at it and you have to know that what you're doing is the right thing and you have to be committed to the better things. As I mentioned before, to attract the good, you have to become good. And a lot of times that takes discipline. And in our modern day worlds where we're completely inundated with nothing but decadence and the idea that like, oh, well, being superficial, being famous, being all these different things, drinking, partying, having fun, it's constantly being forced down our throats. And I would argue that I don't know if that really is happiness. I mean, decadence doesn't really give you happiness. And I honestly think that most people just go in that direction as a way to escape. It's also one of the reasons why you get a lot of scumbags that travel abroad. And I mean that both men and women, not just men, that travel abroad because they want to forget about their problems in their own country. And I mentioned before that that's not really going to make a difference, but as I was saying before about the whole idea of struggle, like it is something that we have to take baby steps at, but you have to know that what you're doing is for the right reasons, not for bitterness, not for anger, but because it's better. It's for the better, not just for yourself, but also for everybody around you. And sometimes it's difficult to actually make ourselves care about those people, especially when you're like, when in my case, I mean, I can talk about this really well. I've said it already. I grew up around really horrible people most of my life. And I mean, it's hard for me to really like sympathize. But then, as I mentioned before, I saw what happened to some of these people, and I actually found it kind of strange because I actually felt bad for some of these people, like what happened to them and how their life choices eventually led them down the path that they did. So I guess that was one way that I saw it, and it was one thing that helped me to discipline myself, to better myself. I still struggle with a lot of stuff. Like I said, my not wanting to reach out to people is a huge one. I tend to have this thing where I actually rationalize. I actually not rationalize. I ration the amount of time that I talk to certain people because I always feel like no, no, don't reach out too much because you never know if this person's genuinely going to care. So it's going to hurt less when they don't care. It's going to be like, oh, well, I already knew that they didn't give a crap, so whatever. But sometimes it's hard to really overcome that, and it is a struggle, and it is something that I work with. And after years and years and years of putting up with bad people, I mean, it's something that even now I'm still struggling with. But if you can take it baby steps, and if you know that what you're doing is not better just for yourself, but also for everybody, for other people around you, then I think maybe you can actually make it work a lot easier. I mean, it's just a little spot. It's like a little bit of advice that I can give, but I think it can give people a little bit of strength, or at least I can hope so.